In the first confusing weeks of this war between Ukraine and Russia, a number of myths and legends grew out in those confused early days and weeks. Um, as information has become clearer, some of those have crystallized and be found to be not true, to have been fabricated or grossly exaggerated. I think the ghost of Kiev or the Russia only sending their conscripts theories. But others have crystallized, surprised the world, and taught us some genuine lessons. And after asking people in a poll what topic of those lessons they wanted to cover, one thing that has emerged is what we've discovered about unmanned vehicles and drones in Ukraine. The revolution or evolution in warfare represented by the success of systems ranging from the famous Bayraktar drones of Ukraine from Turkey, but also everything down to loiter munitions, commercial drones by both sides, all of which generally have proven more effective than most commentators seem to have expected. What I'm going to do today is I'm going to put my classic appropriations investment lens over this whole thing. I'm going to give you a background to unmanned systems that leading up to this war. Investments. What's the general path of unmanned aerial vehicles been and loiter munitions been leading up to this conflict? I'm going to examine the use of unmanned systems in Ukraine, including Russian use. People have complained on some of my videos that I am apparently pro-Ukraine propaganda. I will be covering the Russian deployment of unmanned systems and also loiter munitions in this conflict to a degree as well, because it's part of the lesson that we're learning. We can't just cover the Ukrainians. Then I'm going to pivot. I'm going to look at the economics of unmanned systems because there's some terrifying lessons out of the Ukraine conflict to date when you consider them in the context of how cheap and affordable some of these systems are. And then finally, I'm going to look at what that means for the opportunity for all nations around the world, but particularly middle-sized powers, to potentially disrupt existing defense planning because of the revolution in affairs that these unmanned systems are driving. But first, here are my contentions on paper. First of all, this is not a Bayraktar strong propaganda piece. Yes, the TB2 has done very well. Yes, we're going to talk about it, but I am not shilling for the Turkish drone industry in this presentation. I'm going to try and be fair-minded. I use it because it's an example where we have good amounts of video evidence and it makes the economic argument well. My second contention is that unmanned systems are proliferating at almost every level of the complexity spectrum. Everything from hyper-advanced, very expensive, long-range surveillance unmanned aerial vehicles, right down to people using things that are basically knockoffs of commercial quadrotors in order to do small operations at the squad or even individual level. I'm then contending that systems are proving effective enough in Ukraine to raise serious questions on future spending. Basically, what I'm saying is even if we're not sure exactly how effective drones are in Ukraine, it's clear that they're at least effective enough that their various advantages over manned systems means that countries around the world really need to look at their spending priorities and if they're ready for the revolution in military affairs that these systems is driving. I'm going to contend the cost advantage of unmanned systems runs a lot deeper than it first appears, that it's a lot more complex than just a Bayraktar costs 2 million and a fast jet costs 30 to 80 million. And thus I'm going to contend that there's a huge opportunity for asymmetric return on investment, disruption by small players. Basically, that for a little bit of investment, you can get a lot of additional combat power in certain contexts that might make it easier for smaller powers to stand up to larger ones. Let's get started. Proliferation of unmanned systems. So who's using drones? Because drones have really entered the public consciousness, and they've done so particularly during the global war on terror era, where American drone strikes became famous the world over. Images of things like the Predator or the MQ-9 Reaper became synonymous with the war on terror, coupled with deployments of more expensive and famous systems like Global Hawk as reconnaissance assets. But at the same time, they aren't really driving a huge share of overall spending. I've pulled there from the 2020 budget requests for the US Air Force for aircraft and related systems. You've got that in the top right. $52.4 billion in appropriations for aircraft and related systems, of which $1.6 billion goes to unmanned aerial vehicles. There's 20.4 for combat aircraft, 5.8 for cargo aircraft. There's 1.4 for support aircraft. There's a lot of there for technology and development, some of which, or a lot of which, may go into unmanned systems. But in terms of actual purchases of unmanned systems, 1.6 billion, not a dominant share. So there's a lot of room for these things to expand if they're given priority. These systems have, however, become available to more and more actors, and what you're seeing is a lot more middle-ranking powers add drones to their military repertoire. Turkey is a famous example. Israel powers the world over. But there have always been questions over the capabilities of this system. People have always asked the question of how these systems, cheap and cheerful as they are, would actually stand up in a quote unquote a real war. It's natural for defense industries, for militaries themselves, for politicians to have a bias towards caution. They know their existing systems work or classes of systems work, so they're not exactly quick to go all in on new ideas and systems. And there was a great degree of caution. There's an article there, which unfortunately the title's cut off, but there was a Forbes article on the Bayraktar drones in Ukraine, and it reports on the purchase of the 20 original TB2s, and basically goes on to contend that they wouldn't really matter in a war with Russia because of how, presumably, how slow and vulnerable the system is. There was this belief that a lot of these systems would be chewed up by any competent air defense system, and that argument has been used to dismiss evidence and experience from things like the Nagorno-Karabakh war, where Armenia was absolutely slapped around by Azerbaijani drones, from Syria. There was a great degree of skepticism over whether these cheap unmanned systems would actually be effective if put to a serious test. But now we have actual combat data from Ukraine, conflict with a major military power like Russia, and a relatively together military like Ukraine, after many, many years of Western supports and the immense efforts of the Ukrainians themselves to modernize. And what we're seeing now that these drones are in action, well, let's look at the TB2 as an example. So the TB2, the Bayraktar, possibly the most famous drone to come out of the conflict, far from the only one that's being used, however. It's a medium altitude, high endurance UAV. It uses little miniature anti-tank missiles, so miniaturized ordnance, which again brings the cost down and also means that it doesn't need a particularly high payload in order to carry multiple weapon systems. It has proved itself in past conflicts. Like I said, this thing was the Grim Reaper of Armenian armor during the war between Azerbaijan and Armenia. You can go to Oryx and see the visually confirmed losses for dozens upon dozens upon dozens of T-72s that were slain by this thing during those conflicts. But as I said before, like other systems, there was a reservation about it going up against capable air defense. It's a very cheap system. It's slow. And in a lot of the commentary, if you read the hot takes or listen to analyst podcasts or things like that, you'll notice a lot of chauvinism from individuals in the West about the capabilities of systems like the TB2. Turkish junk was one term I heard. Another great one was someone describing it as sheet metal and a lawnmower engine. Which does a tremendous disservice to a multi-million-dollar weapon system. But anyway, that's the attitude that prevailed about this system. And in Ukraine, they've gone into action and they've emerged as unexpected heroes of Ukraine's ground attack capability. Where the operations of the Ukrainian Air Force seem to have been partly suppressed, or at least shrouded in secrecy, TB2 footage of the drone systems literally striking Russian air defense systems made it out relatively quickly and thus emerged as a near instant meme. People were laughing because these cheap and cheerful drones were destroying, hypothetically, state-of-the-art, very capable air defense systems that had caused NATO to sweat for a little while, that also cost a lot more than the drones themselves. And in the first days and weeks, there was a lot of dismissal, a feeling this can't possibly go on. Maybe the crews just didn't have the systems activated. Maybe the Russians weren't prepared for the drone strikes, and they were being caught off guard. But they keep working. Seriously, they keep blowing things up. They've blown up fuel trains. They've blown up lots and lots of air defense systems, command posts. If you go to the source I provided in my previous video on the Russia conscripts send in the weak troops first myth, you can see a specific page dedicated to just confirmed images and videos of Bayraktar strikes on ground targets. And this started to cause people to ask serious questions, i.e., are the drones actually that effective. I mean, there's a lot of confirmed kills out there. Your lawnmower engine with sheet metal is out there hunting relatively advanced, in some cases, air defense systems like the Panzer or modernized Bucks and Tors. Just think about the irony of that for a moment. An aerial system is out there hunting SAMs. Now, yes, I know suppression of enemy air defenses is a thing with air-launched harms and aircraft, but this is a cheap drone made by a second or a third tier military power like Turkey. No disrespect to Turkey, they're not a military superpower so far as their military industry goes, and it's out there taking out Boers, Tuks, and Panzers. I promise we'll flip this around and look at what the Russian deployment of unmanned systems and loiter munitions has been in a bit. The results, when you look at them quantitatively, are pretty scary, even if you make the most generous assumptions against the TB2. So we have visually confirmed, just look at the Russian losses there, because that also includes Armenian and whatnot, and Syrian destruction from the Syrian war and from the Nagorno-Karabakh war. So the Russian losses are the Tors, the Bucks, the Panzer. So 5 Buck M2s, 2 Buck M1s, a Tor M2, a Tor M1, and a Panzer S1. Even if that's all they destroyed, that is, Ukraine has released 100% of its Bayraktar footage. This is the only kills that the Bayraktar has made, and I know that's not true because there are kills in other systems categories. The systems that they are destroying are extremely expensive high-tech systems. Tors are about 25 million, I believe. Panzer is like 15 million is the figures I've used in my previous presentations. Now, in return for all of this, we have visual confirmation of one destroyed TB2. One. Now, Russia has claimed to have shot down basically the entire Ukraine inventory. But let's just say for a moment that instead of the one confirmed loss, we break our own rule about only using visual confirmation and we assume the entire Ukrainian initial inventory, 20 TB2s, were all shot down in exchange for just these air defense systems. The cost-trade ratio is well in favor of the TB2s. These systems are far more expensive and hypothetically far more capable than the 20 TB2s that we're assuming were destroyed in this example in order to destroy these systems. So even at the most generous stretch, the TB2 has been an immensely cost-effective system. It's basically paper beats scissors. An aircraft is absolutely styling on a relatively complex air defense system, and Russian air defense is reputed to be no joke. And the TB2 is just one of the many, many, many systems in use, and we've seen them across the whole range of complexity. We've seen target drones used as decoys. This is a play on what they did in the Nagorno-Karabakh war, where they sent in drone biplanes in order to try and cause air defenses to turn on their radars so that they could be suppressed or destroyed. Or bait missiles. We've seen micro and civilian drones. We've seen Ukrainians with their cell phones and little quad rotors out there doing little sneak and peek jobs with their little quad rotors, calling in artillery, spotting shell fire, doing little squad level tactical reconnaissance work using just these little drones, and even dropping improvised munitions. We've seen loiter munitions being used. The Russians have deployed their Kubla suicide drones / loiter munitions. Ukraine is getting switchblade loiter munitions. Lots and lots of reconnaissance drones, Orlans from Russia, and equivalents from Ukraine in use. So giving eyes in the sky in the form of unmanned platforms so you don't lose pilots doing recon work. We've seen them being used for artillery correction. We've seen them being used for strike duties. Visually seen them being used for all of these. And as I said, Russia has gained some success in using it too. We've got evidence that they're deploying their Orlans and their Ailerons and the other reconnaissance drones that they have available to them. We've got one example of a captured drone that was potentially being used to bait Ukrainian air defenses. We've seen KUB-BLA loitering munitions. That's a Kalashnikov loiter munition. I'll talk about loiter munitions a bit later. A few have been basically captured after they failed to detonate, but we've seen some cases, at least one case I've visually seen where it is being used and the impact is being observed by another drone. Russians have used small drones to film and in cooperation with their artillery using guided shells. So the Krasnopol round, this is a guided artillery shell. being used, it seems, in close cooperation with drones in some cases. They've used air defense decoys. They've used small recon drones at a local level. The Orlan, which is the most lost category there, you see they've lost 5 Orlan 10 reconnaissance UAVs, but the Orlan's like a $100,000 platform. The KUB BLA is cheaper. So when you're talking about $100,000 that thing's probably cheaper than a Javelin, depending on what block of Javelin and what export partner and what price they're charging. They're not expensive systems. At that point, they're less. You should think of them less as aircraft and more as just ordnance. And it's likely that we're going to see more of them. So I wanted to include this to say, yes, the Russians are using some of this stuff too. Not as famously and potentially not as extensively as the TB2. We can't conclude that, just that we have far more visual evidence of the TB2s being used. But we do have some evidence that the Russians are deploying these systems as well. And in the cases we've seen, deploying them with some levels of success. So, based on what we've seen, why would I conclude that these systems have been relatively effective? Well, we've got to triangulate from a couple of points. The first is the visual confirmed loss data. We have visual confirmations for TB2 kills. We have video evidence of those destructions taking place, which means we've got proof that they're getting at least some kills. The other point is, if we assume that people with limited resources are rational, they're going to use their limited resources on things that help. And one of the things that Ukraine has been spending a lot of the donations and other resources it has on is sourcing additional drones, right down to small civilian quadcopters. Sourcing, I think, there was a tweet there, they bought 500 quadcopters. Taiwan's donating quadcopters, or some Taiwanese companies are doing so. They're actively trying to source more of these things, which you have to imagine in the situation they're in, where you're actively being invaded and your resources are limited, you probably wouldn't be seeking out more of a system that isn't helping. They've requested them from Western powers, in particular the Switchblade loiter munitions. We don't know if they've requested more other sorts of drones. We've also seen videos of people crossing the border, giving donations, and what are they taking with them? They're taking boxes of commercial drones with them to hand over to the Ukrainian armed forces. So plenty of visual evidence of them being used, and plenty of visual evidence of them being effective, and also the Ukrainians themselves requesting additional supplies of them. The counterpoint to this is countermeasures. How effective are drone countermeasures that are being used in Ukraine, and is it likely that they ramp up? And this is both in the hard and soft kill categories. Soft kill is like when you jam a drone so it goes haywire because it's got no guidance and it just flies off harmlessly into the distance and crashes somewhere. Meanwhile, a hard kill is you blow it up. You use a shell, you use a missile, use a proximity fuse, use a kinetic impactor from another drone, where you fly a drone into another drone, a mechanism to basically pull a kinetic kill on the actual drone itself. And this countermeasures point really does deserve its own discussion, because it's the biggest reason that people were dismissing the figures out of the Nagorno-Karabakh war and Syria before we got into the Ukraine conflict. The contention, as I said, was against an actual army with good air defenses. These things will stand no chance. Like against an actual army, they will be destroyed. The argument was drones have not faced quality air defenses. Now, for those who are students of history, this might sound awfully like European armies not really dawning on how effective or dangerous things like machine guns and rapid-fire artillery would be leading up to the First World War, by dismissing evidence from other conflicts because, oh, well, it wasn't like a real war between two major European armies. They kind of dismissed a lot of evidence that they were seeing from other conflicts as atypical, and that things would be more business as usual if two major powers in Europe ever fought. Spoiler alert, they weren't. Those weapon systems were genuinely terrifying, and they changed the way war was fought. Anyway, this school of thought that says drones will be eaten up and destroyed by competent air defense says, well, okay, maybe Russian air defense is just being really incompetent here. Maybe the TB2 is thriving because Russian air superiority fighters and surface-to-air missiles and air defense cannot get their act together. But that raises the question then, why are all the Ukrainian aircraft being shot down? Not all of them, but certainly the Ukrainian Air Force. It's larger platforms. It's MiG-29s, it's Su-27s, Su-25s. They've lost 12. They've only lost 8 UAVs. Only one of them was a Bayraktar. A lot of them were these smaller reconnaissance UAVs, or these really old 2141 reconnaissance UAVs from the Soviet era. Um, the Russian air defense system is clearly good enough that the Ukrainian Air Force is flying a relatively limited number of sorties. They're flying sorties, but a relatively limited number of reported sorties, even by Western sources. And you'd think Western sources would want to pump up the number of Ukrainian sorties. They're admitting that the number is relatively low. And we have visually confirmed losses on 12 Ukrainian aircraft. Now, yes, the aircraft in question are old, but please, I beg you, don't engage in moving the goalposts again. Not every plane out there is an F-35 in clean configuration with massive stealth systems. A lot of what you have to build a military, or a lot of nations have to plan to face in terms of opposing military forces, are systems that are a little bit old, that are a little bit janky, that are a little bit long in tooth, older airframes, even with modernized suites. So you can't dismiss the entire Russian air defense system by ignoring all the Ukrainian aircraft that's either shot down or suppressed. At least I don't think you can do so fairly. Based on this, I would conclude that Russian air defenses in Ukraine, while not optimal, clearly are not toothless, and yet the drones have continued to do their job regardless. So what does that prove? It doesn't prove exactly how effective these systems are. There's a huge uncertainty range. We don't know if we have seen every single kill by a Bayraktar and we're massively underestimating their losses, or if the drones have destroyed 10 times as many things and they've only lost the one that's visually sighted. There's this huge uncertainty range. And even more with the less famous and more unknown systems. We don't know just how effective little quad-rotor guided artillery spotting is. We know it's being used, but it's going to take a long time for us to pass how effective this stuff actually is. So analysis is going to be needed on that point, and it's going to be needed on counters and the probabilities around that. How likely is it that people can improve their game on drone counters? How good are the counters coming down the track? How good are the counters to those counters that are being implemented for the drones? Remember that during the long fighting in the Donbass, there was a period of time where Ukrainian drone operators couldn't operate effectively because Russian jamming and hijacking was getting the better of them. Then they learned how to counter those jamming and hijacking attempts. So you'd need to understand that before you understand what the long-term prospect is in terms of the exact efficiency range of these systems. But it does give us two things. It provides a soft floor on efficacy. We know that the TB2s have eliminated at least as much as we have seen them eliminate. We know that the Russian stuff has done at least as much damage as we have physically seen it do, and we can make some reasonable assumptions around other examples. It also allows us to derive a number of conclusions at varying confidence levels. What I mean by all that gobbledygook right there. What I mean is we can make some reasonable guesses based on the hard visual evidence we have available to us about how effective these systems are. Things like, based on the fact we see the Ukrainians asking for the drones and using the drones are probably not worthless. They probably have some utility to them. And this is where I start to pivot, because this is where the evidence base provided by the Ukraine conflict starts slipping into the decision making, the economics, the stuff that I love talking about. What Ukraine has proved is that these systems have at least a certain level of efficacy, that they can be used against relatively good air defense systems. If your standard is, can it penetrate a multi-layered US standard air defense around a critical strategic site, that's one level. But what we're seeing here is that for battlefield use against what we considered a near-peer opponent, they seem to be reasonably or even highly effective. And that's a problem if you're an opponent of expenditure on these kind of systems, because economically, they have huge advantages over manned systems. And here I'm going to focus mostly on drones that are being operated basically in the sense that TB2 is being used, a short to medium range ground attack platform, basically. And economics does matter. It matters because of the old guns and butter debate. Most nations only have so much to spend on their armed forces, because every dollar you spend on your armed forces is a dollar that you're not spending on feeding people, clothing people, sending them to school, giving them healthcare, or investing in railways and infrastructure for future economic growth. Every dollar does matter. If one plane costs 50 million and another costs 25 million, then it doesn't matter that $50 million system is 10% better. Maybe the two 25s are a better deal. And if you look at systems in this area, there's a lot of cost to consider when you decide where you should be putting your cash. How efficient, in inverted commas, a system actually is. It's not just how much the system costs to buy, it's how much it costs to maintain, the cost of getting a pilot to fly it, the infrastructure around it, the politics around it. So what I've thrown up there is estimates from the US GAO, Government Accountability Office, on the cost of operating per aircraft each of the USAFs and, well, certain platforms of the USAF, the Navy, and the Marine Corps. And they can be huge. The Spirits are obviously up there at the top because they're famously finicky, specialized coverings. You understand why it's expensive. $62.96 million, not to buy the system, but to keep it in service and operate it each year, down to $2.5 million for an Apache. So when you're looking at a Raptor, yes, you buy the Raptor for 60, 80, 100 million, whatever the cost may be in any given year, or depending on whether you include R&D costs or what version of the cut you use. But then you're spending 22.202 million to keep it in service every year, with the slight majority of that being operations and support, and the other a bit less than half being maintenance. You'll notice other platforms tend to slant more towards operating and support and less towards maintenance. The Raptor's a bit finicky in the maintenance sense. Anyway, the costs are there if you want to review them. The point is these systems are expensive to keep flying. So let's break these costs down in turn. Why are manned systems so expensive? Why do unmanned systems absolutely that dominate in this respect? Firstly, just the platform cost. Initial acquisition costs usually far higher for manned platforms. We're not talking about Global Hawk here, which are those giant stratosphere flying high altitude reconnaissance drones. And it's also an emerging development. A lot of drones in their early development, the ones that grew famous in the War on Terror, were actually quite expensive. MQ-9 Reapers, 40 mil plus, they're expensive platforms. Global Hawks, very expensive. But if you're looking at ones that can be used in the ground attack role, and with systems that can actually do what we're seeing the TB2s doing, you might be looking at anywhere from 1 to 60 times the cost to get a manned platform that's doing the job that the TB2 is doing, depending on what sort of aircraft you're using to do that particular task and what ground attack drone you're using. So TB2 is at the cheaper end of the spectrum. If you're using an MQ-9 Reaper, you can probably get a cheap ground attack aircraft that's actually cheaper than an MQ-9 to do ground attack duty. But generally speaking, the cost advantages here favor the drones. At the extreme end of this spectrum, smaller, borderline off-the-shelf drones can actually be cheaper than the air defense weapons that you're using to shoot them down. Famously, this is the case if you look at the attack on Saudi oil refineries by relatively cheap drones, where they're shooting down cheap-ass drones with Patriot missiles. The attacking drones are far cheaper than the ordnance that's being used to attack the target. But as a general rule, outside of all these extreme examples, the unmanned system is cheaper, but also generally has less capability in some respects. On most missions, it's by comparison, it's usually slower. There may be range issues, there may be payload issues. There's a lot of advantages for fast jets in a lot of performance areas. But then you get into more cost issues. Maintenance. Buying a plane is just the start of the violence it will inflict on your bottom line. If you are a relatively well-off person and you buy a pool, this is what I imagine the equivalent would be. It seems like a bright idea at the time until you start having to maintain the damn thing. Now, depending on the platform, keeping an aircraft flying is expensive. US Air Force rates range from $6,000 to $35,000 plus per flying hour. That adds up quickly. As simpler platforms, drone upkeeps tend to be far lower. And also they require fewer flying hours for a reason we'll get into in a minute. So maintaining something like a TB2, or an extreme example, maintaining something like a borderline commercial drone or a loitering munition, Those at the extreme end, those things don't require any maintenance. You keep them on the shelf until you fire them off. The maintenance cost, the upkeep, is just far lower. And also, you can be a little bit braver with maintenance standards when you're not endangering the life of the pilot. Speaking of the pilot, trained pilots are among the most expensive items any military can develop and maintain. I've seen US Air Force estimates for about $6 million to train an A-10 pilot. Australian National Audit Office, 2004, said it costs about 15.4 million Aussie dollars to train a Hornet pilot. Now you convert that to American dollars, you'd cut about 30% off. But still, those are high initial training costs. And then there's about 200 hours every year of flying time just to keep proficient in the basic combat mission sense. And remember those per flying hour rates that we just discussed. You want to get a guy doing 100 or even 200 hours in an F-35 every year, or in a Raptor, the costs are going to run up extremely quickly. You can use simulators for some stuff, but the hours that they actually spend in the airframe are expensive. By comparison, drone pilots are cheaper to train, and here's the big and, if the platform goes down, you don't lose them. If a drone pilot, if a Bayraktar pilot loses his drone after, say, striking a Russian convoy, okay, tomorrow he's flying a new Bayraktar. But if Tom Cruise over here is flying ground attack and he goes down, and he's a POW, you have lost your investment and you have lost the capability represented by that pilot. That has political value, that has economic value, that has military utility. And as simple as it is to state, and as obvious it might seem, it's an important point. Pilots are expensive, you don't want to lose them, and you don't lose them when you're flying drones. And this is a good point for a side note. Life is not cheap. I thought about putting this slide in the other one about the Russian cannon fodder idea. But I'm putting it in here because saving the life of the pilot is an important point, and not putting lives in danger when using your weapon systems is an important point. Losing a person is a tragedy with a really, really long tail, both in the principal perspective of, human life is inherently valuable, but also just from a cold economic perspective. By the time someone turns 18, their nation has spent 18 years investing in them. You fed them, clothed them, educated them for 18 years, and they probably haven't given much back during that time in terms of economic production. They go do their military service, and most after leaving the military will go back to work. Some, maybe unemployed or whatnot, but most will go back, they'll get jobs, they'll generate GDP, they'll pay taxes. And then even after they retire at ages in their 60s or 70s, depending on your culture, but I think, pretty universally, most will go on to provide unpaid services. Grandparents will look after children or help support wider families and whatnot. When you lose a person, you're not just losing a pilot who costs $6 million to train. You're losing every contribution that person will make to your nation for the rest of what their life would have been. The children that will never be born, the jobs that will never be done, the support for others that will never be provided. The death of an 18, a 19, or a mid-20s-year-old can snowball into a really significant economic and social cost. The cost just has a really long tail. It's hidden. So, no, most modern nations don't have blood to spare. They don't have people to spare. If I can spend $1 million to use $1 million worth of technology instead of losing a conscript, then that is an entirely rational, not only human decision, but economic decision. And it's something that weighs heavily in favor of unmanned systems where those systems can be used. Next point is infrastructure. There's an entire support and logistics system that fits around aircraft. This is complex. If you've ever seen an airport, you'll know what I'm talking about. Military air bases are another thing altogether. Note Americans, most other countries don't have the equivalent of like Air National Guard units at their air bases, so we don't get to see F-15s when we fly into airports. Drones tend to, again, it depends on the platform. Some are very finicky, some are not, but the cheaper stuff is usually more tolerant of where you base it, chugs a lot less gas, flies from worse fields, and has a much smaller logistic and support staff footprint. In other words, you can put them more places, you don't have to invest in the bases, you've got more flexibility about where you put them. Depending on the system, you might have a lot more flexibility over where you put the pilots. Pilots do think, in many cases, that they are God's gift to mankind. They demand a certain standard of living. Well, drone pilots, you don't have to base them where the drones are. You can put them somewhere nice and comfortable, and they can fly during their on hours. This is important if you're a nation that wants to operate from non-ideal bases. Not everywhere has top-tier infrastructure, and there are advantages to being able to put your drones in the middle of nowhere. If you're a nation with a very long coastline, for example, and not all of it's populated, or if some of it is really mountainous and not heavily populated, or lacks a serious logistics chain, there are advantages here. And the final point I want to make is accessibility. Sovereign capability is really important defense. And when I mean sovereign capability, I mean the ability to do stuff yourself within the boundaries of your own nation. Economically and militarily, this is really attractive. If you don't have to import a system from someone else, then you're not dependent on them for that system. You're not sending your money overseas, and you're also not creating the jobs overseas. You're creating usually quite high-tech, well-paying jobs domestically within your own economy. So there's lots of incentives to have military industry in your nation. It's why nations spend so much in subsidies and try so aggressively to compete for this. But the problem is, at the complex end, few nations have the ability to design and manufacture advanced combat aircraft well. It's a difficult capability. You really need a large military industrial complex, and that needs to be supported by lots of graduates in the appropriate fields, huge base of human capital, people who've built up their knowledge and expertise. Like Lockheed Martin isn't important just because of their factories. They're important because of their brains trust, the accumulated knowledge of everyone who works there that passes that knowledge down to the next people that work there. I thoroughly recommend Ben Rich's book about the Skunk Works, which talks about this development process in the good old days of Lockheed under Kelly Johnson. So when you're talking about these really advanced systems, few nations have the ability to design, develop, build them in an economically viable way. Try as they might, New Zealand probably couldn't design and build an F-35 equivalent from the ground up, even if they really wanted to. I've talked before about how China still struggles to replicate some parts of what Russian industry knew, particularly with regards to engine technology. They're catching up. It's difficult. But unmanned platforms, particularly the simpler unmanned platforms, are another story entirely. Israel is a major manufacturer. Turkey is becoming a major manufacturer. Australia has the Loyal Wingman program, and most of that's manufactured in Australia. China is a huge global leader in drone manufacturing. There's a lower barrier to entry. You can build a relatively simple drone for combat use as long as you've got a little bit of precision manufacturing talent, a couple of the right university graduates, and a much smaller capital investment profile than it takes to make something like the F-35 program or the F-22 program or the B-21 Raider program work. And because they're accessible, that means if you decide to mix more of these into your military rather than relying on more expensive platforms, whether those be tanks or jets or whatever, you're more likely to be able to build it at home, and that has a whole suite of economic and political advantages. And this argument's even scarier when we talk about the smaller munitions, loiter munitions, small drones. So a lot of you will have heard the stories about the Switchblade drones. There's 100 of them being sent to Ukraine. Firstly, that's not a lot of Switchblades. The Switchblade, there's two models, the 300, the 600. I think it's the 600s that are going to Ukraine. I got a picture of a 300 there. Basically, this is a loiter munition. So think of it as like an individual soldier's smart bomb. It flies and it's individually controllable, and then it's piloted into a target and it explodes. It's like driving a missile in COD or something like that. It's a next generation small scale guided weapon system. There are other loiter munitions that actually take the human partially or even fully out of the loop, where, for example, the Israelis have the suppression of enemy air defenses style one, which is basically an anti-radiation missile that circles an area until it picks up radiation, then it stops circling and goes and blows that thing up. When I say anti-radiation, I mean if an anti-aircraft radar, for example, starts emitting radiation, the loiter munition can pick that up and go blow it up, which is normally a role that would be filled by specific aircraft carrying anti-radiation missiles, waiting to be lit up or have their friends lit up, and then firing a missile and hoping they don't get shot down in turn. Well, you can just do that with a loitering munition. And in some ways, these really small drones have a potentially disruptive impact, kind of like the JDAM, which was the Joint Direct Attack munition, which is basically when the US military industrial complex figured out that instead of building extremely expensive laser guided bombs, they could strap some fins and a GPS computer to all of the old dumb bombs they had left over from the Cold War, and for $18,000 or $20,000 turn them into guided munitions. Really cheap conversion into guided munitions. And this was world changing. I mean, I know pilots that curse it to this day because it basically turned a lot of fighter pilots or multi-role pilots from training to do quite exciting missions to basically being JDAM trucks where they just roll out with their guided munitions and drop them on targets without ever seeing anything. Similarly, potentially disruptive technology. But it gets even better because the entire system here, at its extreme, might cost less than the flying hour for a platform. The Switchblade, the little one, costs like $6,000. It costs $6,000 to fly an A-10 for an hour. And this thing, sending it on its one-way trip, costs $6,000. You can keep it on its shelf and fire it when you're ready. The cost and accessibility advantage of these small systems is even more extreme than when you're talking about the TB2s. Most nations that set their mind to it can probably build something like this. Can probably build you take some commercial style drone technology, you put some smarts around it, some good software, some decent sensors, keep it cheap, and then manufacture it. You don't need a particularly scaled industrial base. You don't need Lockheed Martin in order to build this thing. So where applicable, this thing is an opportunity for really asymmetric return on investment. What do I mean by that? Well, if all the major powers are currently spending most of their funds upkeeping their established systems, they're keeping up their jets and their more advanced platforms, and you have a little bit of room in your budget and you are way behind, you can spend your limited budget on purchasing unmanned platforms that have these capabilities, keep them on a shelf, and you're accumulating potential combat power. And you're lowering the gap with your major power competitor. So let's just say hypothetically, you're a small nation, you fear invasion by your large neighbor. Your large neighbor is maintaining a very large Air Force, Army, Navy, Naval Infantry, paratroopers, etc. You can invest, and you want to deter an invasion, you might choose to invest in more of these unmanned systems to narrow the gap, to give them something else to worry about. The side note here is that there's terrifying potential for non-state actors in these systems. I really don't want to know what's going to happen once terrorists have access to not dozens, but potentially hundreds or thousands of these things. Quite terrifying. And I'm also going to mention the potential of commercial drones here because I haven't scared you enough. What we have seen in Ukraine is little commercial off-the-shelf drones being used for battlefield purposes. We already knew this was possible, but now we have visual evidence of it. We've seen the Ukrainians using civilian drones to drop modified grenades onto targets. We've seen them building one that can drop Molotov cocktails, although they have no evidence that one's being used in combat. We've seen them being used for artillery spotting, for tactical awareness. All these uses for basically non-military spec, non-ruggedized civilian drones. And I asked the question here at the end here. There are scenarios, surely, where you can deal with having one less jet in your inventory in exchange for having, say, 6,000 or 14,000 extra switchblades, or 1,000 extra more advanced, heavier loiter munitions. There's a point where a little bit of investment buys you a lot of a capability, which forces your opponent to do an asymmetric counter, i.e. they spend more countering your spending than you're spending in return. And this is an inversion of the usual relationship. An anti-aircraft missile used to shoot down an aircraft usually costs less than the aircraft. The anti-tank missile used to kill the tank costs less than the tank. In this situation, the weapon that's being intercepted, these little loiter munitions or these small drones, may cost less and require less investment than the weapon system being used to counter them. One example is I've seen US experiments with firing a Stinger missile out of basically a Javelin system with a bursting charge, proximity fuse to take out drones. That's going to cost more than a lot of the things you're firing it at. And that provides an opportunity for the new power or the minor power who's choosing to invest in these capabilities, or for a major power that chooses to give these things a higher priority in its investments. So what are my key takeaways? I've tried to keep this one shorter. Hopefully it's been helpful. The Ukraine-Russia war is again giving us signs that the full range of unmanned aircraft and loitering munitions are potentially highly effective. We've seen just about everything being used in some respects, and the evidence base we have so far is enough to suggest that these weapons are at least a degree of effective. The TB2 has achieved wins. These smaller drones are being useful. The Russian munitions have scored some victories. And that gives us a baseline level of an expectation of, yeah, you know what, maybe these things do work in a major conventional conflict. That being said, these systems are so much cheaper and so accessible that now that we know that they work, it's likely that they'll continue to disrupt business as usual in defense investment. Just as, and we'll probably do a video on this, armored corps probably have to do a little bit of thinking about what their plans are, given what we've seen happen to armored vehicles when they go up against modern ATGMs and light infantry tactics with a little bit of drone assistance in Ukraine. Likewise, the rest of the defense establishment is going to have to seriously ask, are we investing heavily enough in our unmanned platforms? Are there tools that we have in service now that are too vulnerable to these things? Do we have appropriate countermeasures? Are we investing in countermeasures? Are we serious enough about this? Because there's a real danger that someone else is able to improve their balance of power relative to you by investing in these things or planning for them when you stick with business as usual. The adoption of these new systems will, as I've said, give smaller powers a chance to stand up in a sense. The limitations of these platforms anyway seem to favor the sort of fighting that smaller powers are going to be doing. For example, if you look at the TB2, the thing does not have the speed, range, altitude, or payload to do penetration raids or long-distance strategic aviation. That's still the domain of the sort of expensive platforms that we've seen with the major powers, at least for now. But for sort of the small, localized fighting that most powers are going to be worried about, potentially being invaded by a larger neighbor, for example, they're proving plenty effective, and they might be useful for balancing the books and providing a little bit more of a deterrent. That said, there are more unanswered questions over potential countermeasures. There's the issue of cost inversion I talked about, where it costs more to counter a system than to build it. And as long as that's the case, you're going to see out of control investment in these systems by everyone who can make use of them. But if that relationship is able to invert again, if, for example, it becomes easier to intercept or jam or destroy these systems than it does to deploy them, let's just say jamming becomes really, really effective. Those soft kill systems become irresistibly effective. Or someone comes up with really cheap, affordable hard kill systems. There are some really smart autocannon proximity fuse based systems being tested around the world, for example. If those evolve, then it may be that some of these systems lose some of their utility. Although I struggle to believe that things that are so cheap, things like the Switchblade or whatnot, will lose utility because you'd have to come up with a really cheap counter in order to make that effective. My final point is, yes, Bayraktar strong, but it's important that nations stop and take a cold look at their plans and the role these systems are going to play, rather than just buying a whole bunch of TB2s. Like, the lesson of the Ukraine conflict is not the TB2 is a Wunderwaffe and you should go buy 1,000 of them. The lesson is not that if you are Finland, you should spend your entire defense budget on the largest fleet of commercial quadrotors you can and rig them all with Molotov cocktails and grenades. That is not the lesson of the Ukraine conflict. You do not have the confidence to conclude something like that. What you can conclude is that these things work to at least a certain degree, and we'll keep watching to see the extent to which that's true. We're learning a lot about how they can be used. We already know economically that they absolutely trounce manned systems in most regards when it comes to cost and deployment, accessibility, maintenance, domestic production, a whole other suite. And as a result, there just needs to be a little bit of discipline in national spending priorities to ensure that you're not buying just what you know, that you're not buying the fast jets because you always had the fast jets, that you're not buying a Rolex when, like, the watch on your iPhone will do. Unmanned systems are proving effective, and if you want to maximize the efficiency of the dollars that you have available to spend on defense, then maybe it's worth following the Ukrainian example and ploughing a lot of what you can find into the most cost-efficient stuff possible. One of those is unmanned systems, and another is shoulder-fired anti-tank guided missiles, and that's what we will talk about at some point in the future. But for now, I hope this was useful. Hope you enjoyed it. Tried to keep it sharp and punchy. I've given you a summary of drone use in Ukraine, what that means for investment elsewhere. Next time when I'm back, it's either going to be, I'm not sure yet, it's either going to be ATGMs and what they mean for the future of armoured investment, or it's going to be a look at the use of reservists and irregular forces in Ukraine, or it may be another topic. I'm monitoring the conflict day by day. I read all the comments and posts, so I look out for topics that are of interest for you. Thank you very much for listening. I've been overwhelmed by the response to date, and I hope you've enjoyed this one as well. See you again soon.